If you've lived in your house for 20, 25, maybe 30 years, the septic system works fine. The toilet's flush, nothing backs up, there's nothing coming up in the yard. So when you decide to sell the house, you assume the septic system's the one thing you probably don't need to worry about. But then somebody tells you you may need a septic compliance inspection. And here's the surprise. The septic system can appear to work perfectly well and still create a problem for you when you sell. That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm Ed Hayter, realtor, broker, and general contractor. This is the first video in a new series I'm calling Things That Fail a Home Inspection. Now, technically, a home inspection is not really a pass or fail test, and a septic compliance inspection is usually a separate inspection. But these are the kinds of things that can suddenly become important once you're getting a house ready to go on the market. And septic is a good place to start because it can catch a long-time homeowner completely by surprise. One of the first things I hear from homeowners is, "But Ed, it works." And they're right. The toilet flushes, the drains work, there's no sewage sitting in the yard. But working and compliant are not necessarily the same thing. A compliance inspection looks at more than what you can see from inside the house. It looks at the septic system itself and whether the existing system meets the applicable requirements. And those requirements can vary depending on where the property is located. Here in Minnesota, there isn't one point-of-sale septic rule that applies to every house. The requirements can vary by city, township, or county. So before I tell you to automatically order an inspection, one of the first things I want to know is, where is the property and what does that particular jurisdiction require? That is something I want to understand before we put the house on the market. Now, you don't need to become a septic expert to sell your house, but it helps to understand the basics. Wastewater leaves the house, it enters the septic tank. Solids settle out in the tank. The liquid then leaves the tank and moves into the soil treatment area, or what most people call the drainfield. The soil does a big part of the treatment, and that's why things like the condition of the tank, the drainfield, the soil, and groundwater separation can matter. The important point is, there are things happening underground that you cannot judge simply by whether this toilet still flushes. Over the years, I've developed a process that I like to use when I'm dealing with a property with a septic system. I work regularly with a septic pro who can inspect systems and also design them, but he does not install them. And I like that arrangement for a few reasons. If he looks at it and it's obviously going to fail, rather than do a mandatory reporting, he'll just treat it as a consultation and offer to design the new system or the repair that you need. If a repair is possible, he'll design the repair. If a replacement's necessary, he can design the replacement. And I like his designs rather than using a designer that also installs, because his designs tend to fit the property better rather than the installer's equipment better. It just comes out with a better overall product in the end. And because he isn't bidding the install work, his job is to figure out what makes the most sense for that property. If you own a home with a septic system and you're thinking about selling, I put together a more detailed guide that explains the inspection process, what compliance means, common problems, and what your options may be if the system needs work. I'll put a link below in this video if you'd like a copy. A non-compliant system does not always mean the exact same thing. Sometimes there may be a repair that solves the problem. Other times the system may need to be replaced. That's why I like to understand the problem before jumping to conclusions about the solution, because there can be a big difference between repairing part of a system and replacing the entire system. And here's another thing that surprises homeowners. If the septic system has been there for decades and it eventually needs to be replaced, the new system may look completely different. Maybe the existing system uses a conventional drain field, but after looking at the soil, groundwater conditions, available area, and the property itself, the new design may require something like a pressure system or a mound. And a mound can be a very visible change to the yard. So this isn't always just a question of where do we put another drain field. The designer has to figure out what will actually work on that particular property. This is also where the rest of the property becomes important. Where's the house? Where's the driveway? Where are the trees? Is there a garage or a pole building? Is there room for a replacement system? And if you were planning an addition, another garage, a pool, or some other improvement, could that interfere with the area needed for septic? That's why I look at a septic as part of the property, not just as a tank buried in the yard. Here's a good example of why I like having a designer look at the entire property, not just the easiest place to install a system. On this past listing, a more typical approach might have been to put a large mound right in the middle of the yard, several feet high and wide enough for multiple lines. Instead, this system was designed with a single line 100 feet long and placed along the tree line. This kept it off to the side, made the mound much lower, less noticeable, and preserved most of the usable yard. The system still had to meet requirements for the property, but the design made a huge difference in how intrusive it was. And if you're watching this because you're thinking about buying a rural property, all of this works in reverse. A septic system by itself would not scare me away from a house. In fact, I own 2 with septic systems. But I do want to know what I'm buying. How old is the system? What type is it? Is there a current compliance information available? Has it been repaired? And if it eventually needs replacement, where could that replacement system go? Those are much better questions than simply asking, well, does the toilet flush? So, let's give Septic the first seller impact rating for this series. Cost risk? Yeah, it's pretty high. If replacement's necessary, Septic can become a significant expense. Sale risk? Also high, because a septic issue can affect negotiations, timing, and potentially whether the transaction even moves forward. And finally, fix before listing. My answer is investigate first. This can depend. Don't assume it's fine just because it works. But don't automatically panic and start spending money either. First, understand what the local requirements are. Understand what system you have. And understand the actual condition of the property. If you've owned your home for a long time and you're getting ready to sell, septic is one of those things I'd rather understand before the house goes on the market than discover after we already have a buyer. And this is going to be an ongoing series. We'll look at roofs, siding, electrical issues, foundations, and some of the other things that can become problems during a home inspection. If there's something in your house you're wondering about, put it in the comments below. It may become one of the next videos in the series.